clerk of the Quaker Council for European Affairs, and it's my role here to facilitate this next session, which is the speech from our keynote speaker this weekend, Molly Scott-Cato. Molly is a member of the European Parliament. Hello, friend.
You haven't got the root there.
Where's the device?
Oh.
Little grey box.
There it is. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Brent.
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent. Molly is a member of the European Parliament representing South West England. She is one of 3 Green Party MEPs from the UK and one of 2 members of the European Parliament with a Quaker affiliation. She has lived and worked within South West England for all of her adult life and has been working and researching in economics for many years. Some of her areas of interest include land ownership and food production, around renewable energy, particularly locally owned renewable energy, cooperatives and self-managed firms, and also issues around peace and nuclear weapons and nuclear power. She's been the Green Party spokeswoman on economics and finance for the last 15 years. Before that, she's held a number of other positions within the Green Party and has been doing her parliamentarian work within Europe over the last year. She's going to be speaking to our main theme around building a new Europe and the kind of Europe we would like to see, and I'll ask her to begin when she's ready. Once she's finished, there will be time for questions and answers for an hour, after which point we will finish at 3 o'clock, and then we'll have our free time until the next session begins at 4. So Molly, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you for inviting me and to you all for being here. It's always nice to speak at a Quaker event. You always get the best food and get a good audience as well. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say later on. So Oliver introduced me in terms of my main issues and areas of interest. But actually, I'm not going to particularly speak to those areas today. I'm going to speak about foreign policy type issues. And this has actually been quite a challenge for me because I kind of didn't really go there at all until I was an MEP, and I thought I'd be able to kind of, leave that to other people a little bit. But as soon as I was elected, almost everything we had to deal with was in some sense a foreign policy issue, and I've had to actually develop my knowledge and expertise fairly rapidly. And I think what I was doing originally was thinking, there are experts, so people who know about that, and they'll be able to help me with this, and I don't know very much. And over time I've thought, maybe my thinking actually wasn't too bad here, and a lot of the experts I think are totally wrong, actually. That's certainly what I find in the Parliament, but I think we find that in our domestic politics in the UK as well. So there's been a lot of kind of rethinking and soul-searching going on by me, and lots and lots of different issues, different parts of the world, but I think familiar causes of the problems that we're seeing. So I'm not a big person for dogma or catechisms or anything like that, and what I particularly like about Quaker ways is that there are little tiny phrases that you can sort of memorise, and they guide you when you're in doubt. And I'm going to take as my text today. No, the only one I'm going to cover today is that we are called to live in the virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion for all wars. Because that is the best little phrase for talking about foreign policy, and I find it hugely useful on these issues where I feel much less familiar, but also very useful on the issues that I deal with and have been dealing with for many years in the area of economy. So I would very much actually value your views, because I think the views of people who are committed to peace in the fundamental way that Quakers are not heard a great deal in the debates, and I would particularly value hearing your reflections, having been at this conference for some time already, to help guide me in my future work. So there's 4 issues I'm going to mostly talk about. Actually, no, mostly 3. Peace directly, and then the issue of migration and the issue of the need for global institutions. But before I do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about what I do in the Parliament. The main job I've got is about tax and tax justice. And pretty soon after I was elected, I was given this job on behalf of the Green Group. And then the LuxLeaks scandal happened, and we found out exactly what governments were doing, in fact, to support tax avoidance. And at this point, all the guys in the group suddenly thought, oh, I want to do tax. It sounded like such a dull little thing. And suddenly it became the most exciting thing of all. So I fought very hard to keep a grip on it. And so I still do have some of the interesting jobs, but not always the most interesting ones. But as a group, we are very committed to dealing with tax as the Green Group. And so almost immediately LuxLeaks happened, we started campaigning for an inquiry committee, which is a kind of, it's a thing that they have in continental politics that we don't really have in Britain, but it's when parliamentarians kind of call the other institutions to account, really, in a quasi-judicial way. Anyway, you know, there's a long story about internal politicking, as you can imagine, but we do have a special committee now looking into tax, and it's just been extended for another 6 months, so that's keeping me quite busy. And you may have heard just recently that the Competition Commissioner, Margareta Vestager, has announced that she's going to investigate McDonald's, and she's already investigated Google and Apple. So there's some support in the Commission for this work, making sure that corporations pay their taxes properly. And of course that's directly linked to issues of justice, because effectively it's a way of making sure that corporations that make a lot of money actually have to contribute a fair share back to pay for the services that they use. Now, when I think about living in the virtue of that life that takes away the occasion of wars, I think that these issues of justice are absolutely fundamental, and that was really what was driving me when I became an economist. Because I've noticed recently, when I've heard people interviewed who are taking a peaceful position on the crisis in Syria, they very often want to say, well, I wouldn't have ended up in this situation, you know, because I wouldn't have acted in an exploitative way towards the Middle East. I wouldn't have started all the previous cycles of violence that have brought us to where we are now. And actually, for somebody like me, it's quite hard to make that argument, because people will say, yes, but what would you do now? And that's a fair question, and we do have to deal with the messy world that has been created by other people's refusal to take seriously the issue of global justice, and to understand the fact that violence comes in these cycles and we need to interrupt that. But anyway, to me, part of the reason for the crises we're facing now is about the way the global economy is structured, and the fact that it has fundamental injustices built into it. And that's what I've tried to do in my economic work, to challenge those and to rethink how a global economy might work in a just and sustainable way. So that brings me to the issue of trade, rather neatly, because I think one of the things that I find most difficult about the European Union is its commitment to this system of trade, which has injustice built into it, really, which works for some countries and not for other countries, and which, to my way of thinking, is a kind of extension of colonialism by another means. Nick Dearden of Global Justice Now, who I'm sure some of you know, tweeted about the migration crisis. You know, isn't it dreadful, all these people coming to our country to take our resources, which we took from them in the first place? And this is the point. This is why I'm a skeptic on so-called fair trade, because actually, I mean, it's fairly clear that if trade was going to end poverty, we would have done that by now. But we've been extracting these resources unfairly over years. And now we have this issue of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is effectively, it's dressed up as a trade treaty, but it's really an attempt by the corporations to write the future rules of the global economy. It's not being done in an open way, it's secret, behind closed doors. I can't see how the negotiations take place. I mean, I'm not allowed to know what goes on in those negotiations. Very limited summaries with an awful lot sort of black penned out, are left in a secret reading room, and when I go there I can't tell you what I read there. And these are very important negotiations in terms of what the global economy will look like over the next few decades. We had the US ambassador in our group meeting this week. He got a terrible roasting, actually. I mean, I was quite surprised, because European politics is usually a lot friendlier than British politics, but yeah. So I was thinking I might be embarrassed by being a bit too confrontational, but people were just lambing straight into him. It was, yeah, and being very, very critical of what's being negotiated under TTIP. And so he said, you can't stop globalisation. You know, it's an inevitable process, and what we're trying to do is to make sure that it's the US and the EU writing the rules and not China writing the rules. Like that was the choice that we had. So yeah, I wasn't rude, actually. You'll be very proud of me, because I was calm and measured, and I said, firstly, you know, globalisation is not like the laws of physics. You know, we're choosing how our economy works, but also we should be maintaining the highest standards and expecting others to rise to those standards, not getting involved in the race to the bottom, which is what TTIP is all about. So, yeah, by all means, raise more questions about TTIP if you like, when I finish speaking. And the last issue I wanted to mention was climate change. Obviously, with the Paris talks in process now, I have to say something about that. And again, I think it's a very clear issue of the talks. In order for them to be successful, there must be justice there, and justice must be seen to be done. We need climate justice to tackle climate change. And from my perspective, climate justice means the richer countries of the world, the countries that have used fossil fuels to build their wealth and to develop technology, must give that technology for free to the countries that are now following us down that path. But in fact, if we give them the renewable technologies and the technologies for a sustainable future, then they don't have to go down the path we've gone down, and they can get to a better future before we can. And that is the vision of climate justice that is the best hope of resolving climate change, I think. And the other issue that I've been focused on is the issue of climate finance, and I've written something in Huffington Post blog if you want to know more about that, because I don't want to go into it in detail now, but just to say that where the money comes from that pays for the kit that you need to move beyond the fossil era is very crucial in terms of who ends up with the power and the money that results from the economy of the future. So if it's funded privately, the poor countries will end up paying investors in the rich countries to solve the problem of climate change in their own countries. Public money would be great, but is, given the sort of straitjacket of austerity economics, is difficult to achieve. And so I propose a system of global quantitative easing, effectively, which is us all agreeing that we will find the money to pay for a solution to climate change. It seems to me, if we can't pay for that, then there's something very seriously wrong. So, having said those sort of brief introduction to some of the stuff I'm doing in the Parliament, I'll just talk a little bit about the work I've done specifically on the issue of peace. I think one of the key arguments that's made by Greens generally on this issue is that we are constantly focused on war-making rather than peacemaking. We are feeding war-making, we are funding war-making, we are selling arms. We see this as an opportunity to actually increase economic growth, bizarrely. And the amount of effort, time and money that goes into peacemaking is tiny by comparison. And this should always be said when issues of war and peace are discussed. And there are representatives that say this, but it's a tiny number compared to the people who will actually seriously argue with me that the arms trade and that the arms industry is an important industry because it creates jobs. As if any job was equivalent, as if some jobs that were completely destructive and led to death and destruction were still jobs worth having. So I think that's a very important argument we need to make, and I was able to write that very shortly after being elected. I wrote an article saying that we should have an end to the arms trade, which seems to me completely uncontroversial, but anyway, it is controversial. I remember a meeting I was part of in Gloucester, Friends Meeting House actually, before the European election, and all the candidates were there, and this
I'm not always hearing you.
Okay, I'm not speaking close enough, yeah.
Thank you.
And I sound so loud to myself when I'm doing this, but anyway. And this issue came up about the arms trade, and so I was the first to speak, fortunately. And so I said what I've just said to you. I can't understand, there's things that can be bought and sold, and there are things that should never be bought and sold. And we all agree about people and drugs, and I put arms in that category. And it was very clear. I was thinking, I'm taking a bit of a risk, but I'll just go for it. I'm in the Friends meeting house, it'll be fine. And the funny thing was that after I'd said that, everybody else had to agree. Nobody was prepared to come out and say, yeah, let's make money out of selling people arms. So I think it's important to say that, because I think it's kind of undeniable. Once you make that case, it's very difficult for somebody to say, no, I would like to see more profit being made from guns. I would like to see more people being employed making bombs. Actually, they do find it hard to make that argument. So obviously one of the key issues in terms of peacemaking is the Middle East, and it should be said that on all these issues, the European Parliament, the European institutions as a whole have relatively limited power, because the member state governments want to maintain that power over foreign policy, and the Parliament has the least power of the three institutions. So we are tabling resolutions. We have made some progress in terms of the sorts of things we say on behalf of the people we represent, but these are not very powerful statements in terms of the actions that take place. Another item I wanted to draw your attention to was something that we passed a couple of months ago in Strasbourg, which was a report eradicating trade in instruments for torture or capital punishment. And this, as much of the work we do, was not widely reported, but to me it's an important step forward that we are calling on the Commission to end trade in goods that can be used to torture people or to execute people. If we are, as a continent and as a parliament, opposing the death penalty, then we should not be allowing the export of those sorts of products. And the other main issue that I've been involved with is the issue of drones and extrajudicial killings. This is another change in British kind of action overseas anyway, which has not, I think, been attacked as strongly as it should have been. Effectively, what's happening now is that certain parts of the world are designated as law-free zones, and the British government has decided that it's acceptable to send an unmanned aircraft and kill people. No trial, no proof that they were the right person, no attention paid to whoever was sitting next to them when the bomb landed on their vehicle or in their house. There's no question that innocent people are dying as a consequence, and in fact, since we believe in innocence until proved guilty, all the people that die are innocent. So anyway, what I'm saying now would be considered a controversial view, because when I've put stuff on Twitter to that effect, other people kind of attack me and call me a jihadi lover and this kind of thing. So it's really quite extraordinary that that international law is simply not being enforced, is just being ignored. There is a case for judicial review which has been supported by the charity Reprieve and is being taken forward by Caroline Lucas and Jenny Jones, who are the two Green parliamentarians that we have. But I know for a fact that before they went to those two, they went to a lot of other MPs and asked them if they would challenge the legality or the illegality of these extrajudicial killings, and they all refused, which I find disturbing and hard to understand, because they're clearly, in my mind, there is clearly no legal case for undertaking that kind of action. So I've been involved with Afzal Khan, who's a Labour MEP from the Northwest, and we are together getting signatures from as many MEPs as we can to ask Mogherini to condemn this action, the foreign policy supremo for the European Union. And we haven't got a huge amount of support, I have to say, but we are seeking further support to have a body of MEPs there who say we are not prepared to see this sort of illegal activity, and we want it condemned and we want it stopped, and we don't want any other countries following down that same route. So if we go back to that idea about seeking out the causes of war, I think another valuable way that we can do that is through defending human rights and defending civil rights right across the world. And the European Parliament has been quite quite active throughout the whole of its life in that. It's actually quite distressing, the number of different appeals you get for people who are being tortured or being arrested and held without trial. So essentially, I think what I thought I had to do is choose a part of the world and put effort focused on that to try and improve the human rights situation there, because if you focus too widely, I think your energy just actually gets dissipated. And so I chose Azerbaijan because a constituent wrote to me fairly early on and said, you know, terrible things are happening there, as indeed they are. So we've supported human rights defenders and journalists who've been arrested. I don't know if anybody knows about Azerbaijan, but it's an oil country effectively, so it's fairly immune from attack from most Western countries. It's been protected, I think, in a way that's not acceptable. And internally, there's a great deal of repression, and civil rights are seriously threatened. So the main human rights defender is called Leyla Yunus, and she's currently dangerously ill and held in jail in Baku, and we're active in trying to raise the profile. So if there's anything you can do about that, please do. Please do, and add your voice to the voices that are asking for her to be released on humanitarian grounds. It's her birthday on the 21st of December, so that's a good opportunity to add to the pressure. We've also been involved in an initiative from the Greens that led to a resolution against the death penalty on the International Day of the Death Penalty, which was a couple of months ago. So that's actually something quite encouraging, because on a lot of these issues I feel fairly isolated. But it's encouraging that if we put forward a resolution to say let's restate our opposition to the death penalty, that is well supported right across the Parliament, and that was successful. We also nominated the Saudi blogger Raif Badawi for this year's Sakharov Prize. Sakharov Prize is basically to honour people who stick their necks out to defend human rights, and particularly if they're punished for that. And so Raif Badawi has been put in prison in Saudi Arabia and sentenced to 1,000 lashes, which obviously he would not survive, effectively just for criticising the government of Saudi Arabia. So we nominated him for the Sakharov Prize, and he was successfully awarded that, so hopefully that will offer him some protection. So that's a very small part of all the crises and difficulties that are happening in the world, and that we try to do our best to manage and to support those who are struggling against in their own countries. But I wanted to also say a little bit about migration, which I understand has been quite a key topic during your discussions. This was really quite personal. I think I'll just tell the story in a personal way, because it's not an issue where I have any expertise, and my fellow MEP, Jean Lambert, is our national expert on this and also works for the group on this. So I haven't really had any need to engage with a lot of energy myself. But obviously during the summer, like everybody in this room, I'm sure, it became just very, very clear that this was a crisis that we weren't managing as we should have been. And perhaps indeed a crisis that was completely unmanageable. And eventually, at some point, I was thinking, well, what can I do? What can I do as an MEP? And at some point, I saw a parallel between the sort of, well, this was kind of like August when all the politicians were on holiday, and that always makes it difficult if a crisis comes to a head then, because actually they're trying to take a holiday and they don't want to do anything. So nothing kind of happens. And that was actually when the crisis was worst, during August. And so at some point it occurred to me that there was quite a close parallel between what was happening now in terms of Daesh and their attacks on people in Syria and Iraq, and the situation facing people because of Nazi oppression during the 1930s. And in fact, a lot of the reaction from the press seemed very similar. And so this, obviously, as a politician, it's the last thing you ever do, other than mentioning Hitler in an argument. You know, you never mention the Holocaust. It's like a really extreme thing to do. But I thought, well, it's an extreme situation, and I think I need to make that parallel publicly. And so I wrote something in the New Statesman, kind of saying what I've just said to you. And then shortly afterwards, Yvette Cooper came out and said something similar. And I thought, I felt I'd had some influence there, but also I felt it was the right thing to do. And there were a lot of journalists at that point that started to turn the corner and say, actually, we do have to help these people. And the sort of very xenophobic reporting that had been happening started to shift. So I find that quite encouraging, because it's it's a situation where, in fact, it was a people-driven response saying this just isn't good enough. People are suffering and they are our responsibility. Now, we could have argued they're not our responsibility. They come from a different continent. They're not part of our community. We could have argued, but actually most people didn't argue that way, and most journalists in the end recognised our responsibility. We haven't been as successful putting that into policy practice, particularly in Britain. I mean, I feel that some European countries have managed what is an enormous influx of people very admirably. And in fact, the reports about European chaos and so on are not really about the European institutions, where actually the Commission and the Parliament agreed a plan very swiftly. It's much more about individual member states. Sorry, I'm not addressing these people, it's quite hard, I have to move around. It's the crisis comes much more because of the disagreement between member states about what they should be doing. But eventually, of course, Germany and Sweden did take enormous numbers of people, and it has reached the stage now where even Swedish Greens, and if anybody is going to be supportive of migrants, I think it would have to be a Swedish Green. Even the Swedish Greens now have agreed to limit people's entry to their country. So it is a huge crisis. It's a crisis that actually feels quite overwhelming, and of course it is still continuing now in this much worse weather. Anyway, so I found it a difficult summer, and I'm sure a lot of people did, just contemplating what this actually meant in terms of our future. But I have to say, at some point I reached a point of realising that actually what we were seeing is that this is a global crisis, and it's essentially of our making. And it really brings us back to that lesson about seeking out the causes of wars and seeking out the causes of conflict, because we are responsible in our invasion of Iraq in 2003, I believe, and also in our refusal to tackle climate change. We are responsible for much of the cause of that migration. And I started to think, I've always seen the global connections between these issues, and I'm sure most Quakers have, and I'm sure most Greens have. But what we're seeing now is that nobody can ignore that. These are global problems. They're shared problems, and we will only resolve them by working together. So even though it's an overwhelming crisis, it does have lessons that I think can help us to find our way to a better future, because it's inevitable that we will have to share the solution to this migration crisis and also to the climate crisis. I'd be really interested to hear what you think about that and how people reacted themselves to migration and what people are doing now. I'm sure we will come back to that. So, thinking, yes, well, this is a global crisis, we need to deal with it globally, but what institutions do we actually have? For so many of the issues that I'm mostly concerned with, we don't seem to have institutions at the right level. So, in the example of tax, corporations can avoid tax because they can move their profits from one country to another, because they are transnational corporations. But we don't have transnational institutions to stop them doing that. And it seems to have taken me an awfully long time to get to this place of thinking that's what we need. But I am now focusing very much on what those institutions might look like. And there's been a proposal in the past year for a UN tax body, for example, that develops and propagates policy to ensure fair taxation on a global basis. And there's also a proposal for a UN body to ensure that corporations keep to basic human rights in terms of their employees. And all these sorts of institutions, you could not impose these from the top down. They would have to begin, I think, like a sort of club, a bit like the International Criminal Court. The most enlightened member states would join these bodies and would require corporations that operated in their territory to meet those standards. And over time, you would encourage more countries to join. And so I think that's, in terms of all the issues I've been talking about, I think we need to be looking for institutions to work at that level. Obviously, in the case of migration, we have UNHCR, we have some global bodies, so we need to support those, and we need to think of ways to develop and strengthen such bodies, I believe. So that kind of brings me to the issue of the referendum and whether we should stay in the European Union, because to me, the European Union is just such a body. It's working across nations, it's attempting to get nations to cooperate, It's proving how very difficult that is, but that doesn't seem to me a reason to abandon that project. And I think if you see the European Union as exactly such a body that's helping to build global trust and helping to raise global standards, then it does seem something that's worth supporting. And so that's the argument I'm going to be making, and I'm going to be very busy with that over the next year or until the referendum's called. And I think it really helps to see the European Union in that way. It may be a very idealistic way, but to me, that's what the European Union's for. It's not just about what Britain can get out of it, or what any member state can get out of it, but it's actually a prototype for a system of global cooperation above the level of nation states, and for that reason I think it's definitely worth supporting. That's all I wanted to say, Oliver. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Molly. I found that particularly helpful in terms of all the ideas of what's happening, what's actually being done to tackle, if not resolve, all of these issues. What I'm going to do is we have half an hour. I suspect and hope there will be many questions and comments, including about what we've been doing, our thoughts and reflections on these issues. And so I'm going to take questions in groups of 3 for Molly to respond to. George is going to be our roving microphone operator, so if you would like to speak, please do so. And when you do, then please say who you are and where you're from, so that Molly knows that as well.
Richard Seaborn, formerly representative of the QCAA in Brussels, now living in Oxford. 2 rather operational questions. I'm a great admirer of the idea of the EEAS, the European Diplomatic Service. Could you possibly give us a bit of a character picture of Signora Mogherini? Is she a kindred spirit and therefore helpful in our aims and ideas? And the second question is, as now in the MEP for a few months, what is the visibility to you of QCEA?
The European Union is so good.
Your name?
Oh, Arthur Charlton, North London. So I'm wondering why the European Union tolerates places like Luxembourg, Monaco, Andorra, San Marino, the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, if it's bothered about multinationals avoiding paying taxes.
And then there was one directly behind you, and then I'll take one here to the left.
Yes, it's mainly about the last part, about how to make those global structures. Yeah, I'm Johan Westra from Antwerp, in Belgium, in Europe, and in the world. So, what I'm often thinking is that sooner, or at least also maybe in this conference, we should maybe make a little jump from thinking about Europe identifying too much with Europe and going indeed to the global structures and living in a world, in a global world. And then the question is indeed, how do we get to global institutions, also democratic institutions like world federalists also try, or the ones who try to modernize the United Nations indeed, and different agencies belonging to them. But another way would be, there's European Union, there are other less developed structures in the world like ASEAN and ASEAN in Asia, and we have the North Americans working together in an economic way to link all those structures also together, and finally you could have something like a world structure.
Thank you. I don't have that much experience of the External Action Service, because I don't really work on foreign policy that much in terms of my committee work. I have come across them slightly in terms of my work on Azerbaijan, and I have to say they struck me as diplomats, which I mean, I'm often arguing we should have more diplomacy, and that's necessary, obviously, for peacemaking, but I think it also can limit the action that people can take, and I've really been pretty disappointed in terms of what the EAS and what Mogherini are prepared to do in terms of Azerbaijan, and I only know that because I'm focused on that area, so I have no confidence that they're acting more strongly against human rights abuses in other countries. In terms of Mogherini herself, she has quite a good reputation. I think she's seen as competent, and that she does wish to act in terms of peacemaking, not peacemaking, but in terms of conflict resolution anyway. But I think she's very much under pressure from the most powerful players, both in terms of nation states and in terms of the political strength of certain parties, and I don't think that is that she would share our worldview. That isn't my perception anyway. In terms of QCEA, I was telling myself this little story over lunch, but I'll share it with you as well. When I first got elected, I wasn't prepared at all because I was too superstitious to think that I might win the election, and it was completely on a knife edge anyway. I'm going to turn around and tell these people this story. So yeah, it was quite a difficult time, just because there was a lot of new stuff as soon as I got elected. But I was actually in the Eurostar terminal, and I had a very nice phone call from somebody in London, in the Quaker office in London, saying, well, we've got a very nice house in Brussels, and if you ever need some peace and quiet, you're very welcome to go there. And by the way, we have rooms. So I stayed there, and so I know the actual house extremely well. And obviously the people who were there as well, and I now live just around the corner, and it's the most peaceful part of Brussels, so all of that was terrific. In terms of actual policy, Andrew approached me about drones, and the work I was describing about drones has been done in conjunction, so that's also been useful. I'm going to move forward and stop that feedback. The tax havens point. The point about tax avoidance is it is being encouraged by member states. And we in the Parliament are, well, when I say we, the more right-wing elements in the Parliament argue that tax competition is a good thing. And if you cut your tax and corporations come to your country, you're helping your country, and that's a good thing. And obviously we argue with that because effectively the corporations are bidding one country off against another until they don't have to pay anything at all. And some of them barely pay anything at all. But the countries take a different position, and there's countries who I think are effectively tax havens themselves. Luxembourg is a prime example of that, but Ireland also has many aspects that resemble a tax haven. And then there are countries like the UK and the Netherlands which kind of have very close relationships with former colonial possessions that are tax havens, and so that's their way of kind of being involved in this tax haven, global tax haven network. And then there are countries that genuinely are trying to make progress, and I think France is a good example there. Although their companies are behaving in exactly the same kind of way, because that's the situation that we're in at the moment, that it's just normal for corporations to shift their profits around to avoid tax. But the commissioner with responsibility for tax is Pierre Moscovici, who is French, and I think he's an ally in the Commission. He always says he's an ally, but I genuinely do believe that. So we bring forward strong proposals that we've fought through the Parliament against people who oppose them there. The Commission is supportive of some of that, but they're very aware that they have to get agreement from the Council, and because in tax affairs it has to be unanimous agreement, any country can stop it. And so Luxembourg could veto any proposal, Cyprus could veto any proposal, Ireland could veto any proposal. And really what we have to do is fight that battle at the level of member states as well. And the most important thing to do is to just make people aware of exactly what's happening. And as an obvious example, Amazon is successfully avoiding nearly all the tax it should be paying, but its trucks are destroying the roads, and then we can't afford to repair the roads because we don't have the taxes that we need to do that. And there could be 100 other examples just like that one. But at the moment what we're trying to do is, the LuxLeaks thing was about member states agreeing particular deals with particular corporations where they might have a lower tax rate as 1%. And all we're trying to do at the Parliament now is to ask for access to the documents that tell us what those member state governments have done. And they are blocking us on that, and we haven't got access to the documents we need. And I'm in a discussion now with David Gork, who does tax policy for the UK, and we asked him for the minutes of the meetings where this was discussed, and he told me that that was equivalent to a freedom of information request, as if I was a citizen, and that the maximum they were prepared to spend on any freedom of information request was £600. I'm not going to get much information for that, am I? Anyway, we're going to respond. We haven't quite got all of this lined up yet, but we're going to respond by saying, okay, well, I'd like an itemised estimate, like he was a builder or something, for exactly what you're going to do, and then give us the cost of looking for everything we want, and then we'll do a crowdfunder to try and get that paid for. And hopefully that will raise some publicity for what should be public information. And on the global institutions, yeah, well, I mean, I would appreciate other people joining in this thinking and planning and writing about what we need to do here, because we do have some institutions already that are useful, and we have some that look like prototypes of what we might need, and then we have other areas where there's nothing, but we clearly have a need for an institution, as in tax policy, as in corporate behaviour, I think. And yeah, I mean, I think that would be great if more Quaker minds could be bent to that task. And I mean, the only area where I would disagree with you is in terms of the trade networks like ASEAN and NAFTA and so on, because I think those are corporate devised and not working for citizens, and then they're definitely not democratic. But in terms of, I mean, if there is a UN body that's already there and working well, let's reinforce it, because all the UN bodies have been undermined by the sort of Bush-Blair era and this idea of coalition of the willing, which effectively means that the powerful Western nations and their satellites. And so I think reinforcing democratic world order is very important.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions. There were a number over here, so I'll take them from this quadrant now, and then we'll carry on round again. So, hands back up again, please, friends. Okay, go for it in whatever order you choose, George.
Thank you. Peter van Leeuwen, The Hague monthly meeting, the Netherlands. If I interpret you right, as a Quaker, you'd like Britain to stay a member of the EU. I was a bit surprised to find out that Quakers in Britain didn't want to come out on that side. So could you help me and provide me with a typical Quaker argument for Britain to leave the EU? To leave. Sorry, of course.
Loretta O'Brien from Limerick in Ireland. And my one big thing is the TTIP and the no review date. That is, in fact, the most important thing that we actually argue for and build into this agreement. If we do not have a review date, we cannot decide whether a thing is successful or not successful. And that is what it is. There is a big run at the minute about corporate governance arguing and trying to sue national governments, and I feel the most important thing we do is we build in a review date on this. I have never known an agreement to have a beginning and no end.
I'm Bradius Maurus from the Poznan Worship Group in Poland. I was very intrigued by your statement that it might have been possible, if you had had the influence earlier, to stop the basic problems in Syria. As I understand the situation, a few years ago, towards the end of the Arab Spring, large segments of the Syrian population rose up against their second generation dictator and tried to remove him, but he fought back entirely too successfully for the liberation struggle, and they received very little assistance from the European Union or the United States or NATO or anyone. So I wonder what you might have done at that point in time, representing the European Union, to prevent the present Syrian situation.
I'll do them in reverse order this time. So, on Syria, the thing is with the argument of the cycles of violence, nobody really knows how far back you go when you make that argument, right? So you're going back to the Arab Spring. I would certainly go back at least 100 years, because I think the origins of the crisis in the Middle East arise from the era of global empires and effectively imperial powers deciding what the appropriate regions would be and the appropriate national boundaries would be, and that then was exacerbated during the Cold War when the West supported certain dictators and the Warsaw Pact, in fact, and the Russian Empire supported other dictators. And the problem for me is nobody at any point considered what the people living there actually wanted themselves. And to simply then say, well, if you rise up against your dictator, you know, that will be a great thing, is just, to me, irresponsible and naive. And there was no attempt at that point to imagine what the Middle East might look like as a series of functional nation states, and that has never been done. And to me, that's the first step. And I hope that the Vienna process includes something like that, but I'm not sure that it does. And what was driving our involvement in the Middle East for all that time was our desire for resources, and particularly oil. And so there was, so to me, that's the origin of the problem. But yeah, I mean, I'm no expert, but I do think certainly 2003 invasion of Iraq massively destabilised the region and was, in my view, clearly illegal. And certainly as a British person, I feel a significant responsibility for that, which has not directly led to what's happening now, but certainly exacerbated the problems. Loretta, thank you for my cup of tea. TTIP, yes, I'm glad most people in the room know about this and what a threat it is, and I've already characterised it as essentially a corporate power grab, which I think it is. So the review clause is less of a concern to me because I don't think it should ever be passed. You know, so I'm not prepared to consider review at this point because I'm not prepared to consider we'll ever live under anything like TTIP. And at the moment, at least two member state governments, Portugal and Greece, have said they will veto it if it ever gets as far as the Council, so perhaps we will be spared. I hope we will. But having said that, I just wanted to talk about the extent to which you can impose a legal contract that is utterly unjust and does not serve the majority of people, because I'd like to talk about the example of the water supplies in Cochabamba. People know about that? And the film called Only the Rain. I mean, that was a piece of law, wasn't it, which said that all water in that city in Bolivia would belong to certain corporations. I think Bechtel was the main corporation. You know, the government decided it would pass that as law, but the people utterly refused to accept that. They could no longer afford to drink water. Even the rainwater belonged to a consortium of US corporations. So the fact that something's written in law, if it's sufficiently unjust, it will not hold, because ultimately the people of Bolivia rejected that and they overthrew the government that had agreed it, and they had a much more enlightened government afterwards. So firstly, let's not allow it to become law, but let's also remember that people will not accept totally unjust laws, and I believe the agreements that are being signed, that are being threatened anyway with TTIP, are totally unacceptable. A Quaker argument to leave the EU, and that was quite funny because then Loretta mentioned TTIP, and that's a pretty good argument if that goes through. Except that if we did leave, David Cameron is actually one of the key cheerleaders for that kind of trade treaty, so we'd almost certainly be worse off in terms of trade outside. But to me, the most concerning thing about the European institutions is that there's too much power in the undemocratic Commission, and there's far too much lobbying of the Commission as well. So, if you wanted to say why we should leave, you could say, even though the British government is a bad government, at least people did vote for it, kind of, under a bad system, whereas the Commission has a lot of power in Europe and nobody voted for them. So that's something that really needs to change. But I think from a Quaker point of view, the way that the European Union maintains peace in Europe is largely uncelebrated but extremely important. And I see that just on a daily basis amongst my colleagues, and it's very impressive. I think after the Paris attacks, the Germans knew. I'm sorry, I'm tearful thinking about it, but it really impresses me the way there is genuine peacemaking going on between colleagues in the Parliament and in the other institutions. An attack on France, the Germans know they have to be there, and the same will be true in reverse. And that's how we're keeping the peace in Europe, because the countries know people are having an institutional memory about war in Europe, and the European Union is counteracting that. And whatever other arguments there are about national benefits and national losses, that is a fundamental reason for Britain to stay, I believe.
Thank you. Further questions, particularly on towards this side? We have one, we have two, and we'll go for three there.
Thank you for what you just said about Syria and about the increasing global power. That is where my question is going. Oh, Eva from Wales. Surely peace can only be sustained if there is local self-determination of people. And rather than going the way of more global institution commissions and so forth, which actually the corporations want towards world government, my question is, what tendencies do you see in the European Parliament to support the local movements, including local movements for independence like Catalonia, Basque, Scotland, Wales to some degree, Germany and so forth, the independence movements in the south of Germany. I forgot the name of what that people is called. But there's lots of them, and what's being done about that?
Thanks. Jeff Tansey, Hampton Bridge meeting. Do you think, you mentioned this global institutions, I think we should try and learn the lessons from how the WTO was created. There's lots of problems, but it's the only institution that has an enforcement mechanism that's backed by sanctions. And if you want to have enforcement on agencies like big corporations, so it's about changing the rules, but also learning what the powers that be did to get the rules that suit them. And a question there to link into the questions that are on finance and the money creation system, because we're all locked into something that drives this with our pension funds and with the way money is created. You talked about global quantitative easing. I'd like you to expand a little bit on that. Thank you.
Hello, Eda from West London. When I was first asked to attend this conference, my area meeting, the big topic was the Greek financial crisis. So I would quite like to sort of hear your views on whether Greece should have left the euro and under the arrangements that were made, what lies ahead for Greece?
Yeah, you're right, that seems okay. Okay, local self-determination. Yeah, I think we've finally reached a point where we are operating as one global system now, and people have talked about global village for quite a long time, but it seems to me that it's really real, and that's one of the things that the migration crisis kind of brought home. But that doesn't mean we want world government, but it does mean that we need some institutions at the global level. And then that raises the question, well, what power will be exercised at that level, and what power is more appropriately exercised at lower levels? And to me, that's still an open question. And in the European policy making, that's referred to as subsidiarity. And subsidiarity says all power should be exercised at the lowest appropriate level. Now, to me, tackling climate change has to be at the global level. It doesn't make sense to do that at any other level. But there are a lot of questions still remaining open about what level it makes sense to make different decisions at. So I would rather see the discussion framed like that than do we want to see nation states that we recognise now breaking up into more nation states? I mean, what would it mean for Wales to become independent? Would it want to have an army, for example? Would it want to exercise defence? But it would, if it became a nation state in the current model, it would be responsible for its own defence, for example. Would it want to be responsible for its own health service? It already has that responsibility. So, to me, that's the way we need to think about these issues. What level, what area, and what number of people does it make sense to exercise these different kinds of powers? And I don't think we've yet resolved that question of what powers should be exercised by at the European level. There's still quite a lot of argument, but Europe is tending to exercise more responsibility on behalf of the people that live within it, and nation states are tending to exercise less. But I would like to see more powers devolved lower than the nation state. So that's one of the arguments we have in terms of this referendum, that actually the UK is a very centralised state. But I'm not necessarily saying, I mean, I support Scottish independence, but I'm not necessarily saying that the South West should become a nation state, but I would like to see more democratic power exercised at that level. So I think it's a very live question, but I think it's a very complex question, and I'm not sure people are entirely clear what powers they want at what different levels. We are, although I refer to us often wrongly as the Green Group, we're actually Greens EFA, European Free Alliance. So most of the people who are seeking independence and who are elected to the Parliament sit with our group. So we have somebody from Plaid Cymru and 2 Scottish National Party members and 4 members from various independence movements in Spain. So self-determination, I think, is a core principle of green politics, but at the same time I think it's more complex than people just saying, I want to be a nation state. Now I think there's a lot of other questions wrapped up in that. Yes, Jeff, on the WTO, that's an interesting thought. I wish I had more time. I wish I was still an academic and not a politician. I could spend some time thinking about that, but perhaps I need to get somebody to do that for me. Yeah, I thought you were going to talk about divestment, but yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. Well, the thing is, divestment's very important because we shouldn't be investing in fossil fuels anymore, and the Parliament has actually passed a paper, again, that the Greens were very active in building support for, which said we will phase out fossil fuels by 2050, and I think that's visionary and very important. But what that means is fossil fuel assets are currently overvalued, and so we can make a case in terms of financial stability now to say that that we should be divesting from fossil fuels, and both the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, the governor and the president, or whatever Draghi is called, are both saying that that's now a financial systemic risk, and they, under constant questioning from me and other people, they are saying that they have plans for reducing the value of fossil fuel assets, all of which is actually very encouraging and should be celebrated. But I think we need to recognise that distinction between a system that moves around money that's already been created and really getting to the heart of the problem about how that money is created, and challenging the fact that in most cases money is created as debt, in the private sector by banks, whereas the green policy is that money should be created in the public sector, because the issue of money into the economy is a hugely important power that should not be privatised, and that's effectively what quantitative easing would be. But the quantitative easing that's happened so far has been public creation of money, which was then given to financial institutions. So it's been a grossly unequal, and it actually has exacerbated inequality. And so global QE would be effectively the world deciding to create the money to pay for the solution to climate change. But the problem with it is if you create a lot of money, you obviously put a pressure for growth that could be counterproductive. So it has to be designed in such a way that it doesn't just flood out into the global economy and create a whole lot of extra unhelpful economic activity. Obviously I don't have time to explain this in detail, but I can recommend a book which is called Debt and Democracy by Mary Mellor, which came out recently. She writes in a very, very clear way, and she's an eco-feminist economist, kind of by her experience, but she's also got interested in money creation more recently, and it's well worth putting on your Christmas list. And she also helps to explain the crisis in Greece. The crisis in Greece was partly, the Eurozone crisis is a consequence of countries accepting that they will be part of a single currency area, and if you accept that you'll be part of a single currency area, you give up the ability to produce your own money, and obviously that is a huge constraint on the power you have over your own economy. And this is why Britain decided not to join the euro, and I was part of the campaign against the euro, where there were a lot of very right-wing people in that campaign, but there were a lot of people who were progressives, and their argument was also that we need to have democratic institutions matching the place where our currency is made, and that's the problem with the eurozone. It's a currency that's completely detached from any member state and therefore from any democratic accountability, and so the bank can effectively oppress people, as they've done in Greece, as they've done in Portugal and in Ireland, and those people have no redress. But having said that, all the countries that signed up agreed to that, and I think that was their mistake. I would have recommended to Greece to leave the euro, quite honestly, but I think they were very worried about, that if they created their own currency again, it would have very little value against other currencies, and so imports would become massively expensive. There was a stage at which they seemed to be talking to Russia about gas, possibly cheap oil, so maybe they were thinking about that, but ultimately they decided to stay with Europe, and that was what the people wanted. So even if maybe Varoufakis was tending towards the possibility of leaving, or at least considering that, every time they asked the Greek people what they wanted to stay in the Eurozone, and they wanted to stay as part of the European Union. So in fact they followed the democratic mandate the whole way along. But the problem was that the European institutions were completely unresponsive, and that most Germans, unfortunately, don't understand the responsibilities they have as the most powerful economy in the Eurozone, and that's partly because that was never explained when the Eurozone was set up. So, yeah, again, I refer you to Mary Mellor's book, should you wish to find out more about that, because she does explain that fairly clearly, I think.
Thank you. Friends, it is 3 o'clock, so we're going to have to reach the end of our time and let Molly go. Before we do that, let's take a moment's silence to end our meeting and in appreciation for Molly and her time here with us today. Now we have free time from here until 4 o'clock. I don't believe there are any other notices. The workshops part 2 will be happening immediately afterwards, and they will be in the same rooms as previously. rooms 1 through to 4 upstairs, and then here and along through to room G. If somebody has a burning question for Molly, then I'm sure they can come and grab her as she's walking out the door. But otherwise, enjoy your time. Yes, Fred.
That mentioned